So let me do a sound check for those of you online. Maybe thumbs up if you can hear me okay. Good. Should have done that last week for those who are here, remember? And I mentioned last week that we would do the Refuges and Precepts ceremony at the beginning tonight. So just remembering that the Buddha's gradual training, it begins with hearing something or reading something that challenges the way we understand. Doesn't mean we immediately believe what we've heard, but we're hearing it and we're interested enough maybe to suspend belief or to do more investigation until there's some confidence, enough confidence, that we're willing to commit to some kind of training, like to put it into action, what we've heard and are beginning to understand. And in the early Buddhist tradition, and really most of all of the different expressions over the centuries of how people follow in the footsteps of the Buddha, one of the first ways that we commit is we undertake the 5 precepts, the training in the 5 precepts, which is basically like, because the essence of the Buddhist teachings is we're not helpless. And actions of thought, words that we speak, deeds that we do, it matters. Because if it didn't matter what I'm thinking and what I'm saying and what I'm doing, well, there would be no way to transform my life, right? Because it doesn't matter what I do. So it does matter what we do. It's like the beginning of taking responsibility for like what I'm experiencing, like a heart that's tight. Okay, there's a lot I can't control, but there are some things I can control, or I can, and that's really like how I'm thinking, how I'm acting in the world, because it matters. And so once we have enough confidence, then the expression of commitment, like that confidence says, well, okay, I'm going to undertake the training to refrain from killing and harming living beings and taking what isn't mine and causing harm through my sexual activities and through my speech and by getting careless because I've intoxicated my mind. I'm going to refrain from that because I care enough about my life. I care enough about everybody to start doing what's hard to do, which is aligning my life, my thoughts, my words, my actions with what leads to real peace, real happiness, not what leads to agitation and more greed, hatred, and delusion. And in this sense, the precepts aren't about feeling guilty. You know, it's really about getting interested in how do we avoid setting suffering in motion and how do we set happiness in motion. And, you know, depending on your, your history with religion and religious forms, institutions, this may push your buttons, taking the refuges and precepts. But there's a real pragmatic logic to it. So the first thing, the Namo Tassa piece, and those in the room, you can turn to page 35, that's where it is. And John, who's our tech volunteer tonight, has put it into the chat there for those of you online. You can just open that up. So we begin the precepts by just acknowledging our teacher, the Buddha, this person who lived 2,600 years ago. And, we have these forms of the Buddha, like the statue behind me. And we use the Buddha as, like, internally in my heart, as the symbol that there's something I can do with my life, right? Because that person did something with his life. I can do something with my life. I'm not just pushed around by impersonal forces, and that's just how it is. How I understand this natural unfolding of my life changes things. And that's what the Buddha came to understand. And so that's why we align with this idea that there's something that you can do with a human life, just like the guy we call the Buddha, he did something with his human life. We could do that too. So that's why we have that idea. And that's why when we take refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, just on that surface level, we're basically saying things have been done by humans. So I'm a human. I can do those things, right? My life can be transformed like other people have transformed their lives. And there are teachings that support this transformation. And there are people, the Sangha, the third refuge, there are people following those teachings, developing those teachings, and gaining the results, like people in the room. So we take refuge, that's just on the surface level of Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the 5 precepts, it's really like just this very basic level. How I think and act and speak matters. And when I act in ways that cause harm, it leaves an impression. So I'm going to align myself. And it's like, this is easy for us to understand because we know what it feels like when we're mean-spirited. You know, we feel guilty. And then it's a lot of work to justify being mean. And when we're not, when we're kind and when we're take turns and when we care about one another, that tension starts to go away. So it's really just aligning with, most cultures, most people understand this basic truth. So if it's really true in the sense that living with ill will, acting out hate leads to suffering, cultivating generosity and kindness leads to release from that suffering, then we can develop that to the nth degree. It takes us a long way along the path. So we'll do this chant, this ceremony recitation together. And I thought it would be nice to even read Thich Nhat Hanh's reflections for each of the 5 precepts, which is part of this Common Ground. We just modified the traditional recitation a little bit for the Common Ground Refuge and Precept ceremony. So a lot of us use this gesture, Anjali. Feel free to use it if you want. I'm very comfortable with it because I used it a lot as a Catholic growing up. And like I said, we'll do the Namo Tassa. We're going to do it in the Pali language because wherever Buddhism has gone, people did this ceremony in Pali, which is the language spoken at the time of the Buddha. And so just follow along as best you can. When we do the precepts, we'll do the Pali and then we'll do the English underneath. And then I'll just read Thich Nhat Hanh's comment, which is that short paragraph after each of the 5 precepts. So we'll begin with the bell. And then 3 times we acknowledge our teacher. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang saranang gacchami. Dhammang saranang gacchami. Sanghang saranang gacchami. Dutiyampi Buddhang saranang gacchami. Dutiyampi Dhammang saranang gacchami. Dutiyampi sanghang saranang gacchami. Tatiyampi buddhang saranang gacchami. Tatiyampi saranang gacchami. Tatiyampi sanghang saranang gacchami. And now the first precept, first in Pali, then in English. Anatipata veramani sikapadang samadhiyami. I undertake the training to refrain from harming living beings. Aware of the suffering caused by the destruction of life, I am committed to cultivating compassion and learning ways to protect the lives of all beings. I'm determined not to kill, not to let others kill, and not to condone any act of killing in the world, in my thinking, and in my way of life. This is the first of the 5 mindfulness trainings. I vow to study and to practice it. So we're going to take 15 seconds after each one and just contemplate what that might look like in our lives, this vow, this commitment. And now the second. Adinadana where amani sikapadang samadhiyami. I undertake the training to refrain from taking that which is not given. Aware of the suffering caused by exploitation, social injustice, stealing, and oppression, I'm committed to cultivating loving kindness and learning ways to work for the well-being of all beings. I will practice generosity by sharing my time, energy, and material resources with those who are in real need. I'm determined not to steal and not to possess anything that should belong to others. I will respect the property of others, but I will prevent others from profiting from human suffering or the suffering of other species on earth. This is the second of the 5 mindfulness trainings. I vow to study and to practice it. So again, just take a few moments and reflect what that might look like in our lives. And now the third. Kamesu mitchachara where amini sikapadang samadhiyami. I undertake the training to refrain from causing harm through sexual misconduct. Aware of the suffering caused by sexual misconduct, I'm committed to cultivating responsibility and learning ways to protect the safety and integrity of individuals, couples, families, and society. I'm determined not to engage in sexual activities without love and commitment. To preserve the happiness of myself and others, I'm determined to respect my commitments and the commitments of others. I will do everything in my power to protect children from sexual abuse and to protect couples and families from being harmed by sexual misconduct. This is the third of the 5 mindfulness trainings. I vow to study and to practice it. And now the fourth training, the fourth precept. Usawada where amini sikapadang samadhiyami. I undertake the training to refrain from false and harmful speech, aware of the suffering caused by unmindful speech and the inability to listen to others. I'm committed to cultivating loving speech and deep listening in order to bring joy and happiness to others and relieve others of their suffering. Knowing that words can create happiness or suffering, I am determined to speak truthfully with words that inspire self-confidence, joy, and hope. I will not spread information that I do not know to be certain, and will not criticize or condemn things of which I am not sure. I will refrain from uttering words with the intention of causing division or discord. I'm determined to make efforts to reconcile and resolve all conflicts, however small. This is the fourth of the 5 mindfulness trainings. I vow to study and practice it. And now the last, the 5th precept. Shura Meriya Majja Pamaratana where Amani Sika Padang Samadhyami. I undertake the training to refrain from misuse of intoxicants. Aware of the suffering caused by unmindful consumption, I am committed to the cultivation of good health, both physical and mental, for myself, my family, and my society. By practicing mindful eating, drinking, and consuming, I will ingest only items that preserve peace and well-being and joy in my body, in my consciousness, and in the collective body and consciousness of my family and society. I'm determined not to misuse alcohol or any other intoxicants, or to ingest foods or magazines, books, films, conversations that undermine spiritual growth. I'm aware that to damage my body or my consciousness with such poisons is to harm all beings. I understand that a proper diet is crucial for self-transformation and for the transformation of society. This is the 5th of the 5 mindfulness trainings. I vow to study and practice it. And then there's a traditional closing now. Idam me silang magafalanyana pachayo hotu. May my conduct conduce to attainment of the highest fruits of liberation. So let's settle in for some sitting time. And, it's nice to hear Thich Nhat Hanh's reflections on each of the 5, but ultimately, it would be nice for each of us to have our own reflection for each of those 5 that makes sense to us. So don't take the words from Thich Nhat Hanh as anything but just a way to begin the reflection about these trainings in non-harming and what that might look and feel like for each of us. So I suggest, as we have 15 minutes of quiet time now or thereabouts, just to go through the 5 and just to reflect a little bit more deeply, undertaking the training to refrain from killing and harming, undertaking the training around not taking what hasn't been given, what that looks like, feels like, around sexual misconduct, around speech, not speaking in ways that cause harm, and around the use of intoxicants, which in itself is not unskillful, but to anything that increases carelessness, then obviously makes it easier to cause harm. So we'll begin our silence now. So again, we're learning this art of contemplation. We're contemplating what non-harming might look like and feel like in our lives. So you can contemplate each of the 5 precepts, or you can just bring to mind different places of your life, different relationships, and just feel into what non-harming, how that might get expressed in this particular part of your life, in this particular relationship, for example. Not harming ourselves and not harming others, both. The Buddha teaches about the bliss of blamelessness, or the freedom from remorse, when our thoughts, our words, and our actions become more and more in alignment with compassion and non-harming. It's easy to think of these trainings in terms of a threshold we need to meet. Well, maybe I'm good enough. But we want to keep our heart open that there's endless refinement in terms of living in alignment with non-harming. How we speak, the tone, how we relate, even our body language with each other, how we consume, what we do with our resources and our time. And we don't want to think about it in terms of non-harming others, but putting both ourselves and others in the same category. So we're practicing non-harming for ourselves and others together, and not imagining that there's somehow one or the other. Traditionally, they'd be statements when people would do this in community. We would say to each other, "Thus may you know me." This idea that I have enough confidence to make this commitment to the training of in these 5 ways, and thus may you know me. May you actually, as you see me live my life, may you see the results of this commitment, this training. And it's the sort of thing that, it's a training, so we won't always, live up to these precepts, but we just take them again. Oh yeah, I undertake the training to refrain from taking what hasn't been given to me. So feel free to open your eyes and begin to move your body as you need to. When we get teachings that have to do with cause and effect or karma, the conditional, lawful nature of things, we sort of we get confused because we might do something bad, or we watch somebody else do something really unskillful, and yet we might think from the outside, oh, they're thriving, they're not receiving negative results. So it's really important that we don't take these teachings by just, because the Buddha said causing harm is a cause for suffering. We want to really just look at our own heart. We need to develop enough sensitivity so we can actually feel the effect. I was just talking to somebody recently who's a really good practitioner, somebody who teaches here from time to time, and they were just feeling this remorse way back, probably 20 years ago or so, maybe not quite 20 years ago, for some work they were doing, I think writing their thesis in college. They had to kill some mice, maybe probably a biology major or something like that. And just that, was now in their practice coming up. Joseph Goldstein has a story of that too in his own. Some of you know he's a well-known teacher, one of my important teachers. And back in the mid-60s, he did the Peace Corps. And the training, he did it in Thailand, he taught English, but for some strange reason, the training in Hawaii on the way to Thailand was that you had to kill chickens, just a sort of, who knows what they were thinking. But anyway, but later, not that much later, but probably 7, 8 years, maybe a little bit more later, just the the sort of natural result. Because when we do that sort of thing, it's like, what's the heart like in that moment? I have kind of a quirky story that I sometimes tell, even though it's a little out of the box. But when I was 4, thereabouts, so I wasn't that young. I had 2 older sisters. I have 3 older sisters, but 2 that are a little bit older than the third. And they probably adored me when I was a little kid like that. Um, that's my sense, that they were very loving and friendly to me. And one sister was playing with me, and I was sitting, she was lying down, and I was sort of sitting on her belly. And I had one of those little wooden mallets, with the pegs you pound and you flip it over and then you pound them again. I don't know if you remember those old-fashioned toys back in the day. And she had just gotten her adult tooth in. She was probably like 8 years old or something like that. And I don't know, I don't have any memory of this, but it's a big deal because she had a big silver tooth growing up back then. It wasn't until she was an adult that she got a white tooth. And it was probably bloody and, it was probably traumatic. Anyway, as a kid, I had this periodic nightmare of a tooth exploding. I never made the connection, but it was something that happened, once a year or so. That nightmare would occur. And then as a sort of 20-year-old, when I started my meditation practice, it started showing up in my meditation practice, in full view of a conscious mind, sitting there, and all of a sudden the pressure would start to build in one of my teeth, just build. And it was like a little miniature panic attack in a tooth. I mean, it just sort of build, build, build. And then I'd sort of lose my mindfulness at some point. And at some point, I don't know how many times that happened in my meditation, but at some point, I connected the dots. Oh, I have no memory of that. It was probably traumatic. There was probably some mischievous ill will, messing with my sister. It probably wasn't just an accident. Um, and I finally, resolved to just receive whatever needed to happen. And then it stopped happening. The time I could just let the whole explosion happen, obviously it wasn't a real explosion. It was just that sort of something working itself out. So there are lots of these kind of examples, especially in sort of a meditative setting here, when you're around a lot of people who are practicing, where actions, the result of action, will work itself out. That sort of builds our confidence. It isn't like immediate, because a lot of we have this capacity for things to be buried. And the Buddha is very clear, there's no, I think it's something like there's no mountain cleft where you can hide from the results of our actions. And it isn't even deep awakening isn't exempt from that. It's just that when the result of actions come to somebody who's really wise, they're going to relate to the results that are coming their way with a lot of wisdom and a lot of forgiveness and a lot of compassion and a lot of space. That's that simile that I'm sure many of you have heard me say about, that's Buddha calls it the simile of the salt crystal. Remember, and if you take a chunk of salt and you put it in a quart of water, it's going to totally ruin the water. You can't drink it, can't use it for anything because it's so salty. But if you put that same amount of salt in a vast amount of water, like Lake Superior, it's basically not going to have any effects. And the Buddha uses that simile like, so our practice isn't about burning up all our karma. Sometimes people think that way, and awakening means there's no more karma left. There's no unresolved things left. It's not a good way to think. It's not the correct way to think about the path. The path is really developing the kind of mind or heart, a mind vast with love and wisdom, so that when whatever the results of karma are, because karma, like cause and effect, it isn't just personal karma. It's like, local karma, national karma, being on this planet karma. I mean, there's lots of different sort of conditional lawful forces playing themselves out, not just me knocking my sister's tooth out. And all that's just going to keep rolling along lawfully, conditionally, all those sort of things that are in motion. And it's just a question, what sort of heart or mind is going to meet whatever's unfolding? How deep and wide and vast and open and free is that heart, mind that's receiving what's coming? Just like now, right? There's, world karma happening, national karma, local karma happening. So what sort of mind is meeting that? Well, we'd like to have a mind that can really be both intimate and responsive and unburdened, right? Ideally, not burdened by, what's moving these days. So we have these teachings from the Buddha, in many ways. I mentioned last week, 30 some suttas, discourses. The Buddha's talking about this gradual training. Shelley will talk about the Eightfold Path later in the fall. But we're following this sort of way the Buddha would talk about it, like we have to hear the Dharma, we gain confidence, we commit to training, and that's symbolized by taking the precepts, committing to non-harming, and getting interested in harming and what that sets in motion, all the little and bigger ways. And here, remember, we're talking about intentionally causing harm by taking what isn't ours, by, taking advantage of someone sexually with our speech, intoxicating the mind, and that sets up carelessness, so we cause harm that way. And then from there, it's like when we've made that commitment, then we realize there is no way for me or you or any of us to avoid the fact that I have a conditioned mind. Conditioned in the way it was conditioned. Genetically, but also, being raised, like I was born in the late 50s, being raised in that sort of culture, right? So I can't do anything about that conditioning, those tendencies that have been laid down. I have to work with that. And so that one of the ways we want to work with that is like, okay, so when that particular underlying tendency that I have gets triggered because I see something or I hear something or I'm interacting and the interaction is triggering something, right? That's just, I'm vulnerable to whatever the nature of those underlying impulses or tendencies are. So we need some tools like restraint. And restraint can have sort of a couple different expressions. We call it guarding the senses or sense restraint. And, when we hear that, it generally rubs us the wrong way when we hear that. Like, because we have this idea that, wait a minute, I'm practicing Buddhism to be free and easy. And now you're talking about sense restraint, wearing blinders. I mean, people sometimes do that. It's just like going on a retreat. One of the things when we're on a retreat is we're not reading the news, we're not looking at social media, we're not doing these things. So, well, that's sense restraint. So one way that manifests is like, if there are some things that I just don't have the skill, don't have the depth of wisdom to sort of be around those stimuli, it's probably better for me not to be around those stimuli, whatever that might be for each of us. Because, I'll probably act out if I'm there doing that. So that's one thing we can do. We can refrain from be in environments that would activate tendencies that I don't have enough clarity to sort of feel without acting it out. I'll get sucked in, I'll get hooked in some way. But obviously there are a lot of things we can't avoid. So that only helps us, in certain circumstances. Like people who have a issue with alcohol, they might stop going to bars, even though they could order a ginger ale. Just the environment itself would be very triggering. And we probably have all taken advantage of that. But we also want to be able to, the Buddha talks about this in terms of just our perceptual habits. There's a well-known sutta where the Buddha was, somebody came to see the Buddha in the Anjana forest game refuge, right? Kundaliya, the wanderer, came to see the Buddha and greeted him. And after engaging in pleasant conversation, sat to one side. And as he was sitting there, he said to the Buddha, Venerable Gautama, so Gautama is the Buddha's family's name, I'd like frequent gatherings in parks. It's my habit at midday, after the morning meal, to go from park to park, garden to garden. There I encounter various contemplatives discoursing on the rewards of defending their own tenets in a debate and the rewards of condemning those of others, right? So spiritual conversations and debates, that's what he likes to do. So then he asked the Buddha, now in the experience of what reward does Venerable Gautama dwell? And so it's kind of question we might want to ask the Buddha ourselves, like, so you're a well-known spiritual teacher. What are the rewards of your practice? You practice, cause and effect, you got some reward. What are those rewards? Right? I would want to ask the Buddha that. So the Buddha says, he referred to himself as the Tathagata. Some of you know that word is sort of interesting. One thus gone. Anybody feel like calling themselves the one thus gone? Maybe someday. So the Tathagata dwells, this is what he said, the Tathagata dwells experiencing the reward of the fruits of clear knowing and release. And being a curious type, Kundaliya, the wanderer, said, but what are the qualities that, when developed and pursued, lead to the culmination of clear knowing and release? And the Buddha said, the 7 factors of awakening. And you can see where this is going. He's going to ask, well, what are the qualities that lead to the culmination of the 7 factors of awakening? This is one of our Buddhist studies courses, right? Mindfulness, spiritual investigation, being curious about the way it is, effort or steadfastness, joy, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. These are the 7 factors of awakening. And he says the 4 foundations of mindfulness is what leads to the 7 factors. So cultivating a mind that can be intimate with the body, intimate with the arising and passing of feeling tone, Vedana, like, oh, the pleasantness of this experience or the unpleasantness, like really seeing, like in this moment too, like, so for each of us, is this a pleasantness that we're experiencing? Hearing me talk or whatever you're experiencing, is it pleasant, unpleasant, is it neutral? So that's a foundation of mindfulness. And then being aware of the quality of your mind more generally. Is it a collected mind or a scattered mind? And then the 4th foundation is just being aware of the qualities of mind that support awakening and get in the way of awakenings. So those are the 4 foundations of mindfulness, just real quick. So what do you think are because he's going to keep asking, what are the qualities that lead to the 4 foundations of mindfulness? And the Buddha says the 3 courses of right conduct. So this is what we've been sort of talking about. This is sila. So wholesome thoughts, wholesome words, wholesome actions. Those are the 3 courses of right conduct. These are the 3 ways we act. thoughts are considered actions, that karmic actions. If I think a certain way, it leaves an impression in my heart. If I speak a certain way, it leaves an impression in my heart. If I act in the world in a certain way, it leaves an impression in my heart. So thoughts, words, and actions done with intention create karmic results. That's the basic law. And this is, in sort of Buddhist circles, this is considered the first expression of real wisdom. When we start to live from our own experience with the understanding that thoughts, words, actions have consequences. And we start getting interested in that, actions done with intention. So what are the qualities that lead to this being wholesome, having wholesome thoughts, wholesome words, wholesome actions? And the Buddha says, restraint of the senses. And he's going to go into some detail now. And how does restraint of the senses, when developed and pursued, lead to the culmination of the three courses of right conduct? There is a case where a practitioner, on seeing a pleasant form with the eye, does not hanker after it, does not delight in it, does not give rise to passion for it. Unmoved in body, unmoved in mind, one is inwardly well composed and well released. On seeing an unpleasant form with the eye, one is not upset, one's mind is not unsettled, one's feelings are not wounded, one's mind does not become resentful. Unmoved in body, unmoved in mind, one is inwardly well composed and released. And he's going to say this with all the sense gates. So through seeing, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, through hearing, pleasant or unpleasant, smells, tastes, touches, physical sensations, and same with thoughts. On cognizing a pleasant idea with the intellect, one does not hanker after it, does not delight in it, does not give rise for passion for it. Unmoved in body, unmoved in mind, one is inwardly well composed, well released, on cognizing an unpleasant idea with the mind, with the intellect. One is not upset. One's mind is not unsettled. One's feelings are not wounded. One's mind does not become resentful. Unmoved in body, unmoved in mind, one is inwardly well composed, well released. This is how Kundalini, restraint of the senses when developed and pursued, lead to the culmination of the three courses of right conduct. So what the Buddha is saying here is if we want to live in a way where our thoughts, speech, and actions in the world are wholesome, then we need to, he's not saying, the problem is we're too sensitive. No, he wants us to be sensitive. We need the sensitivity. We need the capacity to be vulnerable and exposed and feel what we feel. But we have to develop the wisdom that is not confused when we see a really attractive person, and not disturbed when we see a really, like a person whose body has had a bad accident. I was just, I'm just with my medical condition, I usually have, at least a handful of appointments every month. It's like my second home over at 909 Fulton Street in Northeast, the big clinic by the University of Minnesota Hospital, where I have most of my appointments. And it's so interesting to be there so often and just to see people and people's bodies in all kinds of shape there. It's like most of this is like one of those underlying tendencies I was talking about earlier. It's like I can't help that, being disturbed when you see somebody. I was there just recently and someone was missing part of their face. It's mostly healed. It wasn't in bandages or anything. But it's just like those things really cause a response in my mind, in my body even. And it just to like remember that my heart has the capacity to just feel whatever I'm feeling. Doesn't need to be buried. Same thing like when I do something that's really embarrassing or humiliating. It's been so liberating over the years to realize I can just feel what it feels like to be embarrassed or to feel humiliated. I don't have to like do that dance where I'm trying to diminish or blame or, just that thing we do when there's something that we just can't stand as true. We try to cover it up or bury it or explain it or whatever. And just, of course, it just amplifies the mess in our heart and often for those around us. So this is this, for this part of the course, to really explore and develop confidence in our ability to practice restraint. Like we have the capacity to see what's moving without flinching. Doesn't mean we can do it immediately, but we can aspire to being in the middle of the joys and sorrows, what we call the 8 worldly winds in Buddhism: experiences of gain, experiences of loss, experiences of pleasure and pain, of fame and disrepute, like being embarrassed, doing something that's humiliating, fame, disrepute, praise, and blame, right? The whole range of our human experience. And so the restraint is like that way the mind congeals, like, no, this is not okay. It becomes fixed. This is unacceptable, even though it's true. It's like, so basically the mind establishes itself in a way that is out of alignment with the way it already is. This can't be this way. This is I don't want this to go away, or I want this to go away, and we get fixed. And so it's really about restraint is just because we understand it's not my conditioning, but I understand my wisdom is developing and I'm beginning to intuit and understand that what I really want is to align with the way it is. So when my underlying tendencies, my conditioning is saying no to the way it is, who or what am I going to align with? That underlying tendency that's saying no, or the truth that it is this way? This emotion is moving through, I remember clearly, it was just because my mindfulness was really strong at the time. This is in the middle of a long retreat. This is a long time ago. I did a number of 3-month retreats in a row back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And I had an interview with Joseph Goldstein, and they were charged times, just there's nothing going on except sitting and walking. And then, twice a week or so, I forget how often it is, you meet with a teacher. You've got like 10, 15 minutes to meet with someone. And it's just like there's a lot of energy around that. And just set up on all kinds of levels, like wanting the person, like all the ways that we're conditioned, like wanting the person to love you, wanting to be special, wanting your practice to be special, all these sort of things feed into it, and do I have anything to say? What am I going to say? How am I going to say it? And I remember like leaving the interview, and you just walk down the stairs to this sort of main area. And my mind was just like because I was just feeling so much. It was just overwhelming. I don't remember what the emotion was exactly, but I just remember like my mind wanting to suppress it, like, some version of be calm, be cool. But I wasn't feeling calm or cool at all. I was feeling explosive, and so the restraint isn't that movement of like tapping things down, quieting things down. It's like maybe a lot can move without needing to do anything about all that is there moving. Right? There's some sort of doubt that we can actually feel that much, let that much move. Maybe it's okay there's that much moving. And even it's not about, oh, no, if I'm a Buddhist, tears shouldn't show up, or the body shouldn't quiver or shake. It's like we have all these sort of ideas, but you see how each one of those ideas is sort of like, it's like we're aligning with this idea. There's a somebody here, me, who knows how it's supposed to be, as opposed to nature's going to do what nature's going to do. Can I trust what's unfolding here? So I think this is the thing to explore about restraint, just because maybe the way, we've used that word, guarding the senses, restraint, it's really about, just not getting hooked. So the restraint is really not getting confused or hooked by what's moving. It's not about controlling what's moving. It's about misunderstanding, refraining from misunderstanding what's moving. So we feel the strong impulse, because it's there, to take the strong movement personally. Oh yeah, of course this feels personal. It's good to talk. We might need to talk to ourselves. Of course this feels personal. Of course you don't want anybody to see you. Like normalizing that. But it's like this now. It feels like this. The Buddha talks about like, when we're walking around, living our life, doing what we do, there's this constant impingement, with sounds and sights and touches and smells and tastes and thoughts. Constant. And it's not just the mind, our mind, it has habits, like, because there's so much impingement, so much sensitivity all the time, that there's a very conditioned habit, you could say like perceptual habits. My mind immediately will fix in on a particular sign. There's so much I could be aware of, but it will tune into one thing. And then around that one thing, it will proliferate. It will, the way that I have conceived of that one thing, that one sign, right? It's like observe next time you're like at a bus station or going to the Lynx game, or you're around a lot of people, Mall of America, wherever it is, big family gathering. Just notice every time somebody walks by you, what signs do you attune to? Like it might be you notice what they're wearing, and immediately the habit of the mind is to proliferate around whether that's a nice outfit, whether it's an expensive outfit, or whether it's or something I would want or something I don't want. Or maybe you notice the size of the body, like are they overweight or not? Or maybe you tune into the face, beautiful face, good complexion or not. Or whatever, notice their cell phone. Is it a newer cell phone or an older cell phone? We have, it's like we tune into different things. What do you tune into? Or when you're just walking along, do you notice sort of the trash that hasn't been picked up? Or do you notice other things when you're walking down the street? What do you tune into? Because it really matters, like, what the mind is attending to, what catches our attention, because that's habit. It's not like there's any number of things, like even right now in the room, some of you are looking at me, some of you have your eyes closed, but one way or another, you're attending to something. And this really helps, like, to realize that there's a choice being made. Now, we have to deal with the habit, like the mind. And, I notice this a lot with people I'm very familiar with, like when I'm around my spouse. We've been together for well over 30 years now. And it's sort of like just the sort of perceptual habits when I'm around this person. That's why, relationships can get ossified and they get stuck, because we're just both dealing with very established habits of what we see. And after a while, it's hard to see anything but what we're in the habit of seeing and experiencing with the person. But all this can be very fresh, and we can choose. Because some things, like if it's pushing our buttons, why not pay attention to some other aspect in the present moment? Why pay attention to something that's triggering some deep pattern of aversion or deep pattern of lust or greed? Why would we do that? Well, we do it unconsciously. But if we're conscious, if we're awake, then we can make other choices about what we're attuned to. And so the Buddha says that in many different suttas, don't get caught up in the features and details, or don't get caught up in the sign and the secondary characteristics is another way it gets translated. And this really helps too with restraint, like we're restraining ourselves from those deep grooves in the mind. They're just habits. We need to respect those habits because they can be quite strong and they're persistent until there's enough wisdom. Because once we know it's just a habit, then it becomes relatively easy to see other possibilities. But as long as we think it's just the truth, our perceptual habit, like what we recognize, and then the meaning, it's really a construction process, the meaning I create based on that one little sign. I mean, we're just making stuff up all the time. And we really notice it on retreat where we, maybe we haven't met 80% of the people who we're on retreat with, but there we are 9 days sitting, walking. We see them, we see their socks, we see, because we're not supposed to be sort of looking at people in their eyes so much, but we notice everything. And we start having all kinds of stories of who everybody is, who I want to take a trip with, who I would never take a trip with, who I've already fallen in love with, and ready to pop the question. Really, people go far down that road of attraction because of this process of where there's a sign, sort of a tendency of the mind, and the mind proliferates around those signs. Nimitta is the Pali word. And that's just how the perceptual process works. So we want to illuminate that so that we can we can actually be skillful with what signs the mind is attuned to as we move through our day. So I should probably wrap up so we have time for our small groups tonight. What I was thinking for the small groups, which are not optional, in case you needed a reminder, and that's for all of you on Zoom and all the people here in the room. And remember, you can pass, and there's a real art to the small groups. You sit down, whether you're virtual or you're here in the building, close so you can hear each other, spread around in this building so you're not around other small groups. Go around, just say your name, share your pronouns if you want. Decide who's going to go first, and then what order you're going to go, who's going to keep time. Each person will get 2 to 3 minutes to speak. You can pass, and then check with that person who passed, see if they want to go after everybody else is gone. They could pass again if they want. And so a couple of things that I've mentioned already, you might share a little bit about how you heard the Dharma, how you heard something that kind of sparked your intuition and challenged your sense of the way it is, the way to live, broke the spell a little bit for you. You can talk about confidence and commitment to training and your relationship with the precepts and positive reaction, negative reaction. And you can talk about your experience around restraint and what you've learned, or anything that seems relevant to what we've talked about these last 2 weeks. One thing I didn't mention is just with more and more practice with sense restraint is going directly to the experience of contentedness. Like in just the last minute, one more minute, what's actually in the way of contentment? Like even now. It's not that we have as much money as maybe we'd like, or as much health, as much youth, or whatever that we'd like, but is there actually anything in the way of contentment? Well, one thing is our lack of interest in contentment. The experience of contentment, not the idea of contentment. Like being content with the experience of our body, experience of the heart right now, whatever that is like, the bodily experience. It's really available. That's the amazing thing, except the idea, which is pervasive, that, well, no, this isn't it. This isn't the moment that would lead to my contentment. So that's another thing you can talk about and especially practice this next week. Okay, so John, you can go ahead and divide. We'll come back we'll just go right to 9 o'clock and Central Time, and then we won't come back as a large group. So I think there are about 39 people in the room. We'll count off by 12. Do you want to start?